Follow me to the year 1526 BC. The air in northern Egypt is filled with the smell of the river and the constant activity of the military camps. This is the tension of a military occupation that's been grinding on for decades. In the south, in the ancient city of Thebes, the pharaohs sit as kings of tradition and ritual. But here in the north, in the city of Memphis, they're generals sitting in a high-stakes war room. Over the recent years, the Egyptian state has been obsessed with a single existential security threat. They call this population of foreigners the pestilence, or disease that must be purged from the pure body of Egypt. It's always easier to enslave a people that have been systematically dehumanized first. This atmosphere of suspicion didn't appear overnight. It's the direct result of a century of humiliation and a desperate struggle for survival. The story I'm going to tell you today bridges the gap from the back-breaking forced labor of slavery to an innocent baby, the child of slaves who is adopted into the royal family and named the heir to the throne of Egypt. But to understand why that baby changed the world, you first have to understand the trauma that built the 18th dynasty. Egypt had to claw its way back to sovereignty after being conquered as a nation. For over a century, a group of Semitic rulers, foreigners, known as the Hyksos, held the north. They'd turned the city of Avaris into a fortress and a symbol of Egyptian humiliation. When the Theban princes finally rose up, it was a war for the soul of Egypt, a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing and nationalistic fervor. The great pharaoh Ahmose I eventually broke the siege of Avaris. He chased the Hyksos leaders, the Josephites and the Hebrew tribe of Ephraim, into the Levant and leveled their strongholds. I covered that saga in my last video, so if that sounds a little bizarre to you, go ahead and pause now and watch that first. While the royal class had fled, the common people, the hundreds of thousands of Semitic laborers, traders, and shepherds, remained behind. To the new Egyptian regime, they were a ticking time bomb. These people have been enslaved, they've been purged, and their political leaders have been driven into the desert. But the threat still remains. The Egyptian memory is long, and the fear of a second Hyksos uprising is the primary driver of state policy. This is the great fear that haunts the corridors of power in Memphis and gets written into the scrolls of the Torah. Sitting in the heart of this high-stakes frontier is a royal couple with a desperate secret: Pharaoh Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose. Thutmose is a warrior king, a man who spent his life on the front lines of the expansion. He made his name great on the battlefields of Egyptian conquests. Even with that reputation, though, his ruling power depends entirely on his wife's bloodline. Queen Ahmose is the great royal wife, the daughter of the liberator pharaoh Ahmose I. She is the living link to the legacy, the legitimacy of the dynasty, the sacred vessel of the throne. But together they've got a massive problem because they have no male heir to carry on this fragile legacy. The line of the liberators is staring down the barrel of extinction. The previous pharaoh died with no male heir, creating a crisis in the Egyptian halls of power, a vacuum that had to be filled. And while Thutmose and Ahmose rose to the occasion, they knew a male heir was necessary to maintain their position. In the meantime, while Thutmose is busy planning military campaigns to secure the borders, he's blind to a quiet movement. It's happening right under their noses in the royal gardens. Today, we're diving into the untold story of Exodus chapter 2 and post-war Memphis. We're going to look at how a specific tribe of Hebrews, the Levites, positioned themselves in the inner circle of power. We're going to see how one of the most famous miracles in the Bible looks more like a calculated maneuver to give a baby boy a better life. To understand the odd turn of events surrounding the birth of Moses, you have to see the unique location of his family, the dire circumstances of the royals, and the fragility of power. But before we get too deep into this story, I have a couple of things to tell you. First, this episode is brought to you by servehq.church. It's the easiest way to train your church volunteers. Try it for free for 2 weeks at servehq.church. Second, I'm writing a book. It's the full story of what happened to Israel in Egypt from my perspective. You can get a pre-launch sample of the first chapter and the table of contents, along with a detailed timeline of every major event from Abraham to Mount Sinai at the link in the description. Most people think of the Egyptian capital as Thebes, the city of temples and tombs. In the early 18th dynasty, the real action was here in Memphis. Memphis was the strategic headquarters for the Levant campaigns. This is where the empire's military power was concentrated and where the regional security strategy was developed. Pharaoh Thutmose I was a disruptor, using Memphis as a launch pad to push Egypt's borders all the way to the Euphrates. He wanted to ensure that no foreign power would ever threaten the Nile Valley again. He was building a buffer zone made of brick and iron. Memphis served a dual purpose. It looks outward at the enemies in the east, but it's also looking inward at the Hebrews in the north. These people were right on the royal doorstep, a massive population of outsiders living in the shadow of the palace. The 18th dynasty had corked the bottle at avarice, but they hadn't yet emptied it. The reconstruction of a nation shattered by decades of war required a massive stationary labor force. This made the Hebrew population an essential asset to the crown, even as they were monitored with intense suspicion. This is the central paradox of the New Kingdom. The very people they feared most were the people they needed most to build their monuments. This is where the providential geography comes into play. We often picture the Hebrews as a monolithic group of bricklayers in distant, dusty mud pits. However, the archaeology and the text suggest something much more nuanced and much more dangerous for the Egyptians. Specifically, we need to look at the tribe of Levi. The Levites were distinct from the other tribes. While the others were relegated to heavy labor and field work, the Levites were often employed in specialized roles. They were domestic house servants for the high-ranking officials. They provided low-level priestly support for the Egyptian elite in the temples at Ptah. We see a hint of this in 1 Samuel 2, verse 27, where it says, "Did I not clearly reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest." God was setting up for himself a priestly tribe even before they'd left Egypt. This specialized labor placed the Levite community, including women like Jochebed and Miriam, in the immediate orbit of the royal palace. They were inside the gates. That's really the only reasonable explanation for why Miriam would be able to show up and make a suggestion to the princess like we see in Exodus 2, verse 7. It says, "Then his sister," that's Moses' sister, "said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?'" She was standing right there and able to access the Pharaoh's daughter without restraint. They understood the movement of the water of the delta and the habits of the royalty. They likely knew their concerns of securing the throne by producing an heir. House servants over here whispered worries of their masters quite often. Based on extensive excavations of Memphis, we know that the Nile flows from the southern domestic quarters, where the Levites lived and worked, directly past the royal gardens. The path's already paved by the natural current. If you wanted to smuggle something into the most secure location in the world, you let the river carry it for you. The destroyer of the dynasty, Israel's deliverer, didn't have to break into the palace with an army. He didn't need to pick a lock or bribe a guard. He was carried right to the doorstep of the woman who held the future of Egypt in her hands. He was delivered by the current of the river, the hopes of his mother and sister, and the desperate ambition of a dying line of kings. This moment was the beginning of the end for the 18th dynasty, with a king looking for a son and a people looking for a way out. The current of the Nile is the most predictable force in the ancient world. It moves with a steady, relentless pull that dictates the life of every person living in its banks. When Jochebed placed that basket in the reeds, she was trusting the predictable movement of the Memphis riverfront. She knew the water would carry her son toward the specific section of the bank where the royal family spent their mornings. Exodus chapter 2, verse 3 says, "But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank." The riverbank wasn't just a place for bathing. In the 18th dynasty, the Nile was a sacred stage for royal rituals and the private sanctuary for the great royal wife, Queen Ahmose. Queen Ahmose is a woman defined by her bloodline and her burden. She's the daughter of the pharaoh who liberated Egypt, yet she's currently presiding over a dynasty that's one heartbeat away from collapse. She's surrounded by the luxury of the Memphis palace, but she's also trapped by the political realities of the court. Her husband, Thutmose I, is a military powerhouse, but his legitimacy comes from her. The dynastic pressure on her is immense. She's expected to produce a male heir to secure the line of a liberator, but so far that heir hasn't arrived. And in this case, the royal nursery is full of sons of second wives. These are the children of women who don't carry the sacred blood of the 18th dynasty, yet they're the ones currently positioned to inherit the throne. Queen Ahmose knows that if one of these rival sons takes the crown, her influence and the legacy of her father will be erased. She's looking for a solution, a way to secure the succession without relying on the biological luck of the harem. And as she descends to the water with her attendants, she sees something caught in the reeds. It's a small, tar-covered woven basket, a piece of Levite technology designed to be both buoyant and discreet. Exodus 2 verse 5 says this, "Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it." When she orders her maidservant to retrieve it, she's acting out of curiosity, or maybe a faith that doesn't believe in coincidences, or perhaps the suspicion that the basket carries something specifically for her. She's an elite political operator who understands that nothing in the Memphis palace happens by accident. She opens the basket, and she finds something that she never could have expected. It's a child of the pestilence, a Hebrew infant who should have been purged as part of the death decree that ordered babies like him to be executed. Exodus 2 verse 6 says, "And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.'" The child is crying, a sound that usually signals a death sentence for a Hebrew male in this city. A crying baby would have brought the attention of the executors of the decree. But in this moment, Queen Ahmose sees something else. She sees a blank slate in a child who can be molded, legalized, and used to solve the crisis of the succession. This Hebrew baby is an opportunity. This is the moment of her own political epiphany. She realizes that a child with no Egyptian father can be claimed as a gift from the gods themselves. Such a claim is difficult to deny when the one making the claim is Egypt's own god's wife of Amun, the only woman who can stimulate the Egyptian god to help the Egyptian people. If she adopts this child, he becomes her son. Because she is the great royal wife, her son becomes the legitimate heir, regardless of the rival wives and their children. The idea that's come into her head is a high-stakes legal maneuver. She's choosing to defy the death decree to save the future of her father's dynasty and her husband's legacy. At this exact moment, Miriam steps out from the shadows. She's been watching from a distance. Miriam doesn't approach her with a plea of mercy. No, she approaches with a solution to a logistical problem for the queen. Exodus chapter 2, verse 7 says, "Then his sister," that's Moses' sister again, "said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?'" She asks if she needs a Hebrew nurse to care for the child. It's a tactical offer that provides the queen with a layer of plausible deniability. Miriam is a smart girl. If the queen takes the child directly into the palace, the Hyksos origin of the infant will be too obvious to ignore. The court would see through the deception immediately. But if the child is sent away to be nursed in the Hebrew quarters, he can be reintroduced to the court later as a providential discovery. It gives the queen a little bit of time to prepare the legal framework for his adoption. Exodus chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 tell us that Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, the mother, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. Queen Ahmose agrees to the arrangement. She even offers to pay wages to the nurse, which creates a formal documented contract between the palace and Jochebed's family. Notice Jochebed isn't treated as a slave. Something about the arrangement feels more like a quiet understanding between the two, knowing that the payment is about more than just wages for work. Perhaps it's an acknowledgement of the need for discretion in this moment. This contract also acts as a legal shield. It identifies the child as property of the crown, protecting him from the state-sponsored purges that are still happening back in the brickyards. Without it, the baby is reintroduced to the same threat from which his mother saved him once already. Jochebed is now being paid by the state to raise her own son. The very system that was designed to destroy her family is now funding his survival. During these early years, Moses is being raised with a dual identity. He's learning the language and traditions of the Levites, but he carries the official protection of the Egyptian throne. He's being prepared for a life in the war room of Memphis. His mother and sister are likely teaching him the secrets of their people while knowing that one day he'll have to walk into the palace as a stranger. Exodus chapter 2 verse 10 says, "And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son." When the time for the formal handover arrives, the queen initiates the legal process of ben la. In the ancient world, this is a formal taking as a son that carries the full weight of the law. The Greeks would later call this eis huion. That's the Greek translation of this passage. The placement of a child into the status of a son with full inheritance rights. It's a legal transformation that erases his past and replaces it with a royal future. This phrase in chapter 2, "and he became her son," is full of implications. The word for son here isn't just a male child. It's the son of promise. In a single stroke, Moses is made the heir. He's now the child destined for the throne of Egypt. The queen gives him a name that fits the propaganda of the era. She calls him Amenmose, which means born of Amen, and a fitting name to be given to the son of the wife of Amen. This name is a direct challenge to the rival factions in the court. By naming him after the state god, Amun-Ra, she's claiming that his birth was a divine act of providence. She's using what's called the divine birth propaganda that her father used to justify his own rise to power. She's telling the court that the gods have provided the heir, a claim that's pretty difficult to oppose. To finalize the maneuver, his name is enclosed in a royal cartouche. This is a visual symbol of sovereignty that places him above the other children in the nursery. And to add to the weight of his calling, it's rare for a child's name to be enshrined in this way. Cartouches are typically reserved for sitting royals. He's no longer a refugee now. He's the great overseer of soldiers in training. He's being tutored by men like Pahiri, elite officials whose families built their wealth on the labor of the Hebrews. Moses is learning the art of war from the very men who are tasked with keeping his people in chains. This whole part of Moses' life is a bit of a question mark. I'm going to lean on Josephus and some Jewish traditions, and of course some Egyptian archaeology to fill in the blanks from between his birth to when he flees to Midian. During this time, he's growing up alongside his half-brother Thutmose II. Thutmose is the biological son of the pharaoh and a second wife, and he's the natural rival for the throne. While Thutmose II is often described as sickly and physically weak, Amenmose, again this is Moses, is being groomed as the warrior ideal. The queen is positioning him to be the strong man in the 18th dynasty. It's the very person the 18th dynasty needs to continue its expansion. Watching all of this from the sidelines is a young girl named Hatshepsut. She's the biological daughter of Queen Ahmose and Thutmose I. Hatshepsut is a keen observer of power. She sees how her mother uses religion and law to bypass the limitations of biology, a strategy she'll use later to propel herself to the throne as the first female pharaoh in history. She's learning that in Egypt, the truth of a person's birth is less important than the legitimacy of their legal status. The royal nursery is now a microcosm of the empire's tension. You have the legitimate daughter, Hatshepsut, the sickly biological son, Thutmose II, and the adopted Hebrew god king, Amenmose. This isn't a story about awkward family dynamics. It's a story about a political chess match where a child is the most valuable piece on the board. The Levites have successfully placed one of their own at the very top of the Egyptian military hierarchy. The boy who was supposed to die at birth is now being trained to lead the armies of the men who were commanded to kill him. And the current of the Nile is still flowing, carrying the destiny of the 18th dynasty toward a confrontation that no one in the war room sees coming. The period of the negotiated nursing has finally come to an end. The child's now old enough for a formal integration into the royal household. This transition is incredibly dangerous for Queen Ahmose. She's bringing a child of the pestilence into a court obsessed with racial purity and dynastic legitimacy. It's a high-stakes gamble. Securing this position requires more than a simple legal document. She needs a narrative so powerful that her rivals can't challenge it. They need a story they're forced to believe. In the ancient world, a claim of divine intervention served as the ultimate political trump card. Queen Ahmose understands this perfectly. She knows she must explain the child's birth through theology. She turns to a specific piece of statecraft known as divine birth propaganda. Historically, Egyptian royalty used this strategy to claim a child was conceived by the god Amun-Ra himself. Queen Ahmose is uniquely positioned to make this claim because of her status. She holds the prestigious title of Neferu, the god's wife of Amun. This political office identifies her as the only woman capable of interacting directly with the state god. It's much more than a religious honorific. It's a source of absolute authority. She claims the god found her sleeping in the beauty of her palace. According to her, the child is the literal seed of the god. This story solves two massive problems at once. First, it effectively erases the child's Hebrew origins. By replacing his genealogy with a divine one, she removes the stigma of his real birth. Second, it places him above every other child in the royal nursery. As the son of a god, he outranks the sons of secondary wives who only carry human blood. He becomes the ultimate heir to the throne. The child is formally presented to the court under the name Amenmose. This name serves as a constant public reminder of his claimed origin. His name literally means born of Amen. To the public, this appears to be a miracle. To the inner circle of the court, it's a terrifyingly effective piece of psychological warfare. It's a move they can't counter. Even those who suspect the truth find it impossible to speak out. Challenging the child's origin would be a direct challenge to the queen's status. That's an act of high treason, probably punishable by death. The queen formalizes his status by placing his name inside of a cartouche. This oval frame is reserved exclusively for the names of sovereigns and heirs. It's the ultimate Egyptian brand. This act of branding tells the entire empire that Amenmose is the chosen successor. He's no longer a foundling from the river. He is designated the overseer of soldiers. As he enters the palace as a permanent resident, his education begins in earnest. He's placed under the tutelage of an elite official named Pahiri. Pahiri represents the new order of the empire. His family wealth comes from the administration of the very labor camps where Moses' biological family is still suffering. The irony is staggering. Pahiri and other tutors teach Amenmose the art of administration and the science of the Nile's hydraulics. He's learning the brutal logistics of military conquest. He's being shaped into a leader. He's learning how to rule the people he was born to serve. Growing up in this high-pressure environment, he faces a natural rival in Thutmose II. Thutmose is the biological son of the pharaoh, but his mother was a commoner, a secondary wife. In the eyes of the law, Amenmose has now become the superior candidate. He possesses the divine birth claim and the full backing of the great royal wife. Historical records from this era describe Thutmose II as a weak and sickly individual. He's often overshadowed by the robust, military-trained Amenmose in the history books. This tension in the royal nursery acts as a microcosm of the tension in the empire. The pure biological line is represented by a weak boy. The legal, divine line is represented by a strong, adopted Hebrew. It's a volatile mix. Watching all of this play out is the queen's biological daughter, Hatshepsut. Though she's young, she's already learning the mechanics of power. She sees how her mother manipulated the entire Egyptian priesthood to accept a Hebrew baby. She's learning that in a world of the 18th dynasty, reality is whatever the state propaganda says it is. Truth is merely a tool. Hatshepsut will eventually use these exact same tactics to claim the throne for herself later in history. She's the star pupil of her mother's political school. Meanwhile, Amenmose is being groomed for a specific role in the Egyptian military hierarchy. He receives the title of Great Overseers of Soldiers of the Lord of the Two Lands. This means he's much more than just a prince. He's a general in training. He's being prepared to lead the very armies that enforce the Amu purges in the Delta. The irony of his position is total. He's a Levite, a member of the tribe that will one day become the priests of the Exodus, yet he's currently a high priest of the Egyptian state god. He's being trained to preserve the very system designed to destroy his people. He's a weapon of the Egyptian state, with a secret origin that's waiting to be triggered. The queen's maneuver has successfully corked the bottle of dynastic collapse. She's secured her father's legacy by adopting the very pestilence her father tried to wipe out. As Amenmose grows in strength, the great fear of the Egyptian state is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. They've invited the leader of the next uprising to live in their own home, grooming him to be their next king. By any political metric, Moses has achieved the impossible. He's survived the reed basket in the Nile and the even more dangerous waters of the royal court. Thanks to calculated rebranding, he isn't just a Hebrew foundling anymore, he's a divine addition. To the public, he's a miracle child. To the inner circle of the palace, he's a high-value strategic asset. But this is where the story takes a dark, jagged turn. This is where we stop looking at the prince and start looking at the propaganda machine. In the 18th dynasty, you didn't just go to school. You were indoctrinated into a worldview. A godling like Amenmose, Moses, couldn't be raised by commoners or soft-hearted academics. You needed a tutor who embodied the very soul of the new empire, the new kingdom that had just risen from a century of bloody civil war and ethnic cleansing. And that man was Pahiri. If you were looking for an architect of the Egyptian military-industrial complex in 1526, you'd find him in Pahiri. He was the mayor of Nekeb, a high-level administrator, and a man who knew the exact cost of every brick and every human life in the empire. In some ways, he was the precursor to Senenmut, the outsider who orchestrated backroom deals and managed the operation of the nation under Pharaoh Hatshepsut. But it's not Pahiri's resume that should make your skin crawl. It's his bloodline. Because to understand the man who was teaching Moses how to think, you have to understand the man who taught Pahiri. Pahiri's grandfather was a man named Ahmose, son of Abana. In the Hebrew memory, he's the architect of the end. He was the naval commander who spearheaded the final brutal siege of Avaris. It's his autobiography that gives us much of the specific details of the siege of Avaris and the enslavement of the Hebrews. We need to be honest about what Avaris was. It wasn't just a city. It was the Hebrew sanctuary. It was the place where Joseph's descendants had built their lives while they were still favored guests of the state. It was their capital, their cultural heartbeat. And when the 18th dynasty decided to reclaim Egypt for the Egyptians, they didn't just ask the Asiatics to leave. They erased them. They burned the city to the ground, hunted the survivors into the Sinai, and put the ones left behind in chains. Pahiri's grandfather was the man who led that charge. He was the one who personally broke the back of the Hebrew presence in the Delta. In the Egyptian military, there was a specific award for that kind of service. It was called the Gold of Valor. These were small golden pendants shaped like flies. Why flies? Well, because to Egyptians, the fly was the ultimate warrior. A fly is relentless. It doesn't matter how many times you swat at it, it keeps coming. It was persistent and annoying, and ultimately, it feeds on the fallen. Ahmose, son of Abana, won those golden flies for his bravery during the sacking of Avaris. For every Hebrew he killed, for every high-ranking official he captured, he was rewarded with land and with gold, and most significantly with servants. Think about the irony here. The very slaves who were serving Pahiri's household, the people who likely cooked Moses' food and washed his royal linens and stood in the corners of the room while he studied, were the survivors of the city his tutor's grandfather had destroyed. When Moses sat in that opulent study, he was looking at a man whose family wealth was literally built on the genocide of his own people. The gold of valor hanging around Pahiri's neck was more than just jewelry. It was evidence. It was bought with the blood of Moses' family. Think about the psychological warfare happening in that room every single day. Moses is sitting there, learning his hieroglyphs, the language of the gods. But he's not just learning literature. He's being groomed for high command. He's being taught the art of the state by the man who perfected the metrics of oppression. And what was in that curriculum? First, there was the logistics of labor. Pahiri was a master of the census. He would have taught Moses exactly how many men it takes to build a pylon or a granary. He would have taught him the quota system, the cold, hard calculation of how much work a human body can perform before it physically or spiritually breaks. Moses was being trained to manage and maximize the output of the very slaves he would one day lead into the desert. Second, there were the military tactics. He was learning the use of the composite bow and the chariot, the high-tech tanks of the Bronze Age. And Pahiri would have been very clear about who the targets of these weapons were. They were the vile Asiatics, as they were called, the Amu, the shepherds, the pestilence. Every day, Pahiri looks at this boy, a boy who clearly doesn't look like the rest of the royal family, despite the wigs and the heavy eye makeup. And he teaches him that the world is divided into the rulers and the ruled. He's teaching a Hebrew how to be the perfect Egyptian taskmaster. It's the ultimate irony. The man who will eventually lead the Hebrews out of slavery is being taught how to keep them in slavery by the very man that started the process. We often think of Moses' time in the palace as a period of luxury, as if he was just living in a five-star hotel. But in the 18th dynasty, luxury wasn't just stuff, it was spoils. The fine wine that Moses drank, it came from the northern vineyards seized during the purges. The incense that filled his room, it was tribute taken from the tribes of the east who were now under the Egyptian boot. The very education he received, the scrolls, the tutors, the staff, it was funded by the gold of valor land grants given to the house of Pahiri for his role in the destruction of avarice. But this is where we have to see the unexpected, unseen hand of God in all of this madness. God didn't pluck Moses out of the Nile and send him to a desert monastery to learn spirituality. He didn't send him to a mountaintop to meditate. He allowed him to be raised in the belly of the beast. Because if you're going to dismantle a system as sophisticated and as brutal as the Egyptian empire, you can't do it from the outside. You have to know the art of the state better than the Egyptians do. Moses wasn't just being educated, he was being embedded. Pahiri thought he was training a future general or a pharaoh, someone who would lead the next campaign into Canaan and bring back even more gold of valor. But God was training a general for the Exodus. The more Pahiri taught Moses about how to be a master, the more he was inadvertently teaching him how to be the ultimate liberator. He was handing Moses the keys to the kingdom, never realizing that Moses was the one who would eventually use those keys to walk everyone out. Moses would be Israel's first king, trained by the best that Egypt had to offer. Moses isn't a toddler in the palace anymore. He's a man who's fully integrated into the highest levels of the Egyptian state. He's navigated to the cap, that elite political laboratory where the sons of the king and the children of the nobility were raised together. But Moses didn't just survive his education, he thrived in it. While the history books usually paint him as a quaint shepherd, the reality of Amenmose, the name he carried into the palace, is much more formidable. He was a war hero. He followed the path of his adoptive grandfather, Ahmose I. He mastered the chariot, he commanded the bow, and he led men into the fray. He wasn't some soft prince hiding behind limestone walls. He was a general in the making, a man who'd spent years in the field earning the respect of the veteran commanders who'd once served under the Admiral Ahmose, son of Abana. He was a mirror image of the military greatness that defined the 18th dynasty. Centuries earlier, God had made a promise to Abraham. For generations, it looked like that promise had been swallowed up by the mud pits of Egypt. But God wasn't sleeping. He was working patiently. And this is the truth I want you to grab onto today. The same God who is working behind the scenes in the 18th dynasty is working in your life right now. Sometimes that squeeze that you feel, the pressure at work or the broken friendships, the feeling that you no longer fit in the places that you used to call home, it's not a sign of abandonment. God is fulfilling the promises he made to you, even when the path looks like a dead end. The cliffhanger in this story isn't just about Moses' survival. It's about the faithfulness of a God who doesn't waste a single year. Moses is now a highly trained military mind who knows every secret of the Egyptian state, standing on the edge of a knife. But in the eyes of God, he's exactly where he needs to be.